Some people spend their lives collecting expensive gifts, never realizing the greatest treasure cannot be purchased at any price. Emily Parker slowly parked her aging blue sedan beneath the towering maple trees that lined her grandmother's quiet neighborhood in Franklin, Tennessee. She turned off the engine and sat silently for a moment, looking toward the beautiful white colonial home where generations of her family had gathered for holidays, birthdays, and countless unforgettable memories. Today marked her grandmother Eleanor's 80th birthday celebration, a milestone that had reunited relatives from across the country. Emily gently reached into the passenger seat and picked up a small wooden box wrapped with a simple cream-colored ribbon. There was nothing expensive about it, though it showed tiny signs of age and the ribbon had been tied by hand. Anyone passing by might have mistaken it for an ordinary keepsake. Emily smiled softly before carrying it toward the front porch while wearing her modest light blue dress, comfortable shoes, and the quiet confidence that always came from knowing love never needed to compete with wealth. Laughter drifted through the open front door as family members greeted one another inside the beautifully decorated living room. Fresh flowers filled every corner of the house, framed family photographs covered the walls, and the smell of homemade roast, fresh bread, and apple pie created the comforting warmth only a family gathering could bring. Emily barely stepped inside before her parents welcomed her with warm embraces. "You made it," her father whispered happily. "Grandma has been asking about you all morning." Emily smiled. "I would never miss today." Before she could continue, another voice interrupted from across the room. "Well, everyone is finally here." Victoria Hayes, Emily's wealthy aunt, walked confidently toward the entrance wearing an elegant designer outfit, sparkling jewelry, and a smile polished enough to impress every guest except the one standing before her. Her eyes slowly moved from Emily's simple dress to the old wooden box resting in her hands. "Emily," Victoria said pleasantly enough for everyone nearby. "To hear, I assume someone would have helped you find something a little more appropriate for an occasion like this." Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances while the room gradually became quieter. Emily looked down briefly at the small wooden box before lifting her eyes again with the same gentle smile. "I brought something I believe Grandma will treasure." Victoria gave a light laugh. "I suppose sentimental gifts are useful when someone cannot afford anything memorable." A few uneasy chuckles followed before silence settled across the room. Emily did not answer. Instead, she quietly placed the wooden box beside the gift table already overflowing with expensive wrapped packages tied in luxurious ribbons. Crystal bowls, designer handbags, costly watches, and elaborate flower arrangements surrounded her simple box until it almost disappeared from sight. Without defending herself, Emily walked into the kitchen where several relatives struggled to prepare lunch for more than 30 guests. She immediately offered to help arrange serving dishes, refill drinks, and carry trays into the dining room. Her grandmother noticed from across the room and smiled warmly without saying a word. Only Pastor Jonathan Reed, an old family friend invited to bless the celebration, quietly observed both women. He watched one person proudly display everything money could buy while another quietly gave away everything kindness could offer. Neither woman realized that before the day ended, one small wooden box would reveal which gift carried the greatest value, and every heart inside that house would remember the answer forever. The joyful atmosphere inside Eleanor Parker's beautiful home continued as more relatives arrived carrying carefully wrapped gifts, fresh flowers, and warm greetings. Laughter echoed through the spacious living room while children ran happily between clusters of family members sharing stories from years gone by. Emily Parker quietly moved from one room to another, helping her mother arrange serving dishes, refilling pitchers of sweet tea, and making certain every elderly guest had a comfortable chair. She never looked toward the impressive gift table where her small wooden box rested almost unnoticed among expensive packages decorated with glittering ribbons. To her, the celebration itself mattered far more than being noticed. Across the room, Victoria Hayes accepted compliments as naturally as if they belonged to her. She proudly described the luxury vacation package she had purchased for Eleanor and casually mentioned the cost, just loudly enough for nearby relatives to hear. Several family members smiled politely while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Victoria seemed to mistake admiration for respect, never realizing the difference between the two. As lunch preparations continued, she noticed Emily carrying another tray of homemade bread from the kitchen. "Emily," Victoria called with a pleasant smile that concealed another quiet insult. "I suppose everyone contributes in different ways. Some people bring memorable gifts. Others simply help carry plates." A few relatives shifted awkwardly, hoping someone would change the subject. Emily gently placed the tray onto the dining table before answering with calm sincerity. "Helping family has always felt like a gift to me." Victoria laughed softly. "That is certainly one way to look at it." Without another word, Emily returned to the kitchen where her grandmother sat resting beside the window while watching the busy household with affectionate eyes. Eleanor reached for Emily's hand. "You have been working since the moment you arrived," she said warmly. "Come sit with me for a minute." Emily smiled and settled into the chair beside her. They quietly watched grandchildren playing in the backyard while sunlight streamed through the lace curtains. "Do you remember building birdhouses together?" Eleanor asked. Emily nodded happily. "I still have the first one we made. It is not very straight, but it still hangs in my backyard." Eleanor laughed gently. Some of the most precious things never needed to be perfect. Before Emily could reply, one of the younger cousins ran into the room searching for adhesive tape after accidentally tearing the wrapping paper on a gift. Emily immediately knelt beside the little girl, carefully repairing the package until it looked beautiful again. The child smiled brightly before hugging her. Pastor Jonathan Reed happened to witness the quiet moment from across the hallway. He noticed something he had observed many times throughout his years serving the community. The people who naturally gave their attention to others rarely realized how deeply they were changing the atmosphere around them. Meanwhile, Victoria continued greeting guests in the living room, occasionally glancing toward the simple wooden box resting almost hidden behind larger presents. Every time she saw it, she felt strangely satisfied, convinced it would only remind everyone of the difference between wealth and simplicity once the gifts were opened later that afternoon. She could not imagine that the smallest package in the room carried a value greater than anything money had placed upon the table. Outside, the warm Tennessee breeze gently stirred the maple trees surrounding the house, while inside, the celebration quietly moved toward a moment that would reveal not only what had been placed inside a simple wooden box, but also what had been quietly preserved inside one humble heart for many years. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished hardwood floors, the Parker family home grew even livelier as more relatives gathered to celebrate Eleanor's milestone birthday. Children chased one another through the backyard beneath towering maple trees while laughter drifted through the open windows. Inside the kitchen, Emily Parker quietly washed serving bowls, arranged fresh fruit, and helped her mother prepare dessert without waiting for anyone to ask. She moved naturally from one task to another, making certain every guest felt welcome before thinking about herself. Her simple light blue dress had become lightly dusted with flour after helping decorate homemade cakes, yet she never seemed to notice. Across the room, Eleanor watched her granddaughter with affectionate eyes that reflected decades of treasured memories. She gently reached for Pastor Jonathan Reed as he passed nearby and smiled toward Emily. "She has always been that way," Eleanor whispered. "Even as a little girl, she believed love was something you showed with your hands more than your words." Pastor Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. "Those gifts usually take the longest for people to recognize." Meanwhile, Victoria Hayes continued entertaining relatives in the elegant living room. She proudly described recent business achievements, expensive vacations, and luxury renovations to her home, drawing polite admiration from several guests. As conversations turned toward birthday gifts waiting on the large oak table, Victoria glanced once again at the small wooden box tucked quietly between brightly wrapped packages. She smiled to herself before saying loudly enough for nearby relatives to hear, "I suppose every celebration needs at least one mysterious little surprise. Although I cannot imagine what could possibly fit inside something that small." Several cousins laughed awkwardly before quickly changing the subject. Emily happened to walk past carrying a tray of lemonade and heard every word. She simply continued serving drinks with the same gentle smile she had worn throughout the afternoon. She neither defended herself nor explained anything about the wooden box. A few minutes later, one of Eleanor's youngest great-grandchildren wandered toward an old bookshelf searching for coloring supplies. While looking behind several photo albums, the little boy accidentally knocked a faded family scrapbook onto the floor. Its worn pages scattered across the rug, revealing old photographs that had slipped loose over the years. Emily immediately knelt beside him. Instead of worrying about the mess, she smiled reassuringly and carefully gathered every picture, brushing away tiny traces of dust before placing them back inside the album exactly where they belonged. Eleanor quietly watched the scene with tears beginning to form in her eyes. She recognized many of those photographs because Emily herself had spent countless weekends restoring damaged family pictures, repairing torn pages, and preserving memories that everyone else believed had already been lost. Emily never mentioned the countless hours she had devoted to protecting those precious moments. She simply believed every family deserved to remember where love first began. Victoria noticed Eleanor smiling warmly toward Emily and felt another familiar wave of frustration. No matter how impressive her own accomplishments appeared, the quiet affection surrounding her niece always seemed impossible to compete with. She convinced herself that once the gifts were finally opened, everyone would naturally admire the expensive presents instead of sentimental gestures. Outside, gentle Tennessee breezes carried the scent of blooming dogwood trees across the backyard, while golden sunlight settled softly over the celebration. Inside the house, the forgotten wooden box remained unopened on the gift table, holding a story that would soon remind every generation gathered there that the most valuable inheritance is never measured by its price, but by the love it quietly preserves. As the afternoon celebration reached its happiest moment, Eleanor's family gathered inside the spacious dining room where a beautifully decorated birthday cake rested beneath soft candlelight. Warm conversations gradually faded as everyone took their seats around the long wooden table. Crystal glasses reflected the golden sunlight streaming through tall windows, while fresh flowers filled the room with the gentle scent of spring. Pastor Jonathan Reed stood near the fireplace, preparing to offer a blessing before the meal. Just before he began speaking, Victoria Hayes slowly rose from her chair holding a sparkling glass. "Before we celebrate," she announced with a polished smile, "I would like to say how grateful we all are that our family has been blessed with success and prosperity. Grandma deserves only the very best today." Several relatives nodded politely while listening. Victoria continued, allowing her eyes to drift toward the large table filled with expensive gifts. "Every present here reflects years of hard work and achievement. I hope each one reminds Grandma how deeply she is loved." Her words sounded generous, but the final sentence carried another hidden edge. Looking directly toward Emily, she added with a pleasant smile, "Although sometimes good intentions are all a person can afford." A few uncomfortable laughs echoed through the room, before silence quickly returned. Several relatives lowered their eyes, embarrassed by the remark. Emily quietly looked toward her grandmother instead of responding. Her expression never changed. She simply folded her hands together and offered a warm smile that carried neither resentment nor shame. Eleanor noticed everything but remained silent, allowing the moment to pass without interruption. Pastor Jonathan gently cleared his throat before offering the family blessing, speaking about gratitude, compassion, and the priceless value of shared memories. His words seemed to settle softly over the room, easing the tension that Victoria's comments had created. Once everyone began serving lunch, Emily quietly excused herself from the table after noticing one of the elderly neighbors invited to the celebration struggling to balance a full plate while using a walking cane. Without drawing attention to herself, she carried the plate to a comfortable chair, brought fresh water, and asked whether the guest needed anything else. The elderly woman smiled gratefully. "Your grandmother always said kindness arrives before it introduces itself," she whispered. Emily simply smiled and wished her a wonderful afternoon before returning to help refill drinks for the children. Across the room, Victoria watched the scene with quiet frustration. Every attempt she made to place herself at the center of attention seemed to fade whenever Emily quietly helped someone else. It puzzled her because Emily never asked for praise, never defended herself, and never competed for recognition. Yet people naturally felt at peace whenever she was nearby. As dessert was finally served, Eleanor looked around the room at the faces of her children, grandchildren, relatives, and lifelong friends. Her eyes rested briefly on the small wooden box that remained almost hidden among towering stacks of elegant presents. A gentle smile appeared on her face before she softly announced, "After dessert, I would like to open every gift together. I believe each one carries a story." Victoria leaned back confidently, convinced the expensive presents would become the highlight of the afternoon. Emily quietly lowered her eyes, gently touching the ribbon wrapped around the simple wooden box for just a moment before stepping away. No one noticed the quiet emotion reflected in her smile. No one except Pastor Jonathan, who somehow sensed that the smallest gift waiting on that table carried the largest piece of the family's heart, and, before another hour had passed, every person gathered beneath that roof would discover a truth that could never again be measured by wealth. After the birthday meal ended, Eleanor gently folded her napkin and smiled toward the large table overflowing with beautifully wrapped presents. Conversations gradually softened as children gathered beside their parents and every family member found a place nearby. The afternoon sun filled the living room with warm golden light, reflecting across polished wooden floors and the framed photographs that covered the walls. Eleanor looked around at every familiar face before speaking with quiet gratitude. "Your presence is already the greatest gift I could receive," she said warmly. "But I would love to open each present together because every gift carries the love of the person who chose it." One by one, elegant packages were placed into her hands. She admired a luxurious silk blanket, a designer handbag, an expensive watch, and a travel package that Victoria proudly explained in careful detail. Each gift received sincere appreciation, and Eleanor thanked every relative with genuine affection. Victoria smiled confidently as several family members complimented her generosity. She believed the afternoon had unfolded exactly as she expected. Finally, only one package remained on the table. It was the small wooden box tied with a simple cream-colored ribbon. Compared with everything surrounding it, the box appeared almost forgotten. Victoria smiled politely before saying, "It seems we saved the smallest surprise for last." Several relatives looked curiously toward Emily, wondering what could possibly be inside something so modest. Emily quietly stepped forward and gently lifted the wooden box with both hands before placing it into her grandmother's lap. "I hope this brings you joy," she said softly. "That is all I ever wanted." Eleanor carefully untied the ribbon instead of cutting it, as though every detail deserved respect. She slowly opened the weathered lid and paused. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. The room became completely silent. Instead of jewelry or expensive treasures, the box contained dozens of carefully restored family photographs, handwritten letters from relatives who had passed away, old recipe cards written in Eleanor's mother's handwriting, children's drawings preserved inside protective sleeves, military service medals that had once belonged to Emily's grandfather, and neatly labeled envelopes holding stories about each generation of the Parker family. Resting on top was a handwritten note. Eleanor unfolded it with trembling hands and quietly began reading aloud. "Grandma, families grow stronger when they remember where love first began. Over the past several years, I searched through old attics, albums, storage boxes, and forgotten drawers, so these memories would never disappear. Every photograph has been restored. Every letter has been protected. Every story has been written down for the generations still to come. This box does not belong to one person. It belongs to our entire family." Eleanor could no longer continue reading as tears gently rolled down her cheeks. She carefully lifted one restored photograph showing herself and her late husband standing beside a tiny farmhouse many decades earlier. Several relatives leaned closer, recognizing pictures they believed had been permanently lost. Others quietly discovered handwritten letters from grandparents they had never met. The atmosphere inside the room changed completely. No one noticed the expensive gifts anymore. Every person had become absorbed by the priceless memories resting inside the humble wooden box. Victoria stared silently from across the room, unable to speak as she watched family members wipe away tears while passing treasured photographs from one generation to another. For the first time that afternoon, she realized she had spent years measuring value by price, while Emily had spent years preserving something money could never replace, and deep inside her heart, a truth she had tried to ignore for far too long had finally begun to awaken. The living room remained completely silent as Eleanor gently held the restored photograph against her heart. One by one, family members carefully reached into the wooden box, discovering pieces of their own history they had believed were gone forever. An elderly uncle quietly unfolded a letter written by his father before leaving for military service decades earlier. A cousin found a faded recipe card in Eleanor's mother's handwriting that everyone remembered from childhood holiday dinners. Another relative smiled through tears after recognizing a carefully restored photograph from a family reunion that had been damaged in an old basement flood years before. Every item inside the simple wooden box seemed to carry a voice from the past, gently reminding each person that the greatest parts of a family's story could never be purchased in any store. Emily stood quietly near the window, watching her grandmother smile with gratitude as memories traveled from one pair of hands to another. She never stepped forward to explain how many evenings she had spent searching through forgotten attics, visiting distant relatives, restoring faded photographs, or recording family stories before they disappeared forever. She believed those moments belonged to everyone, not to herself. Pastor Jonathan Reed slowly walked toward the wooden box and carefully lifted one of the restored albums. "This is remarkable," he said softly. "Preserving a family's history is one of the greatest acts of love a person can offer." Eleanor gently nodded before looking toward Emily. "She has been doing this for years," she said quietly. "Every birthday, every holiday, every visit, she asked me another question about our family's past. I thought she was simply curious. I never realized she was building a gift for generations I may never even meet." Several relatives turned toward Emily with expressions of surprise. One cousin smiled and asked, "You did all of this by yourself?" Emily answered with her familiar, gentle smile. "Many people helped without even realizing it. They shared stories, opened old boxes, and trusted me with memories that deserved to be protected." Victoria remained seated without speaking. The confident expression she had carried throughout the afternoon had completely disappeared. She slowly looked around the room and noticed something she had overlooked for years. No one was admiring the value of expensive presents anymore. Every conversation centered on shared memories, family traditions, forgotten stories, and the people who had shaped their lives long before wealth had entered anyone's vocabulary. The expensive gifts remained beautifully wrapped nearby, but the small wooden box had quietly become the heart of the celebration. Eleanor reached into the box once more and removed a final envelope addressed simply, "For Grandma." Inside rested a handwritten family tree extending across several generations, accompanied by a promise written in Emily's careful handwriting. "May every child who comes after us know the names, stories, sacrifices, and love that built this family before they ever knew our own." Eleanor gently closed her eyes for a moment before embracing the wooden box, as though holding every generation together at once. Tears filled the room, yet they were not tears of sadness. They were the quiet gratitude that arrives when people remember what truly matters. Victoria lowered her eyes, feeling every careless word she had spoken earlier echo inside her heart with painful clarity. For the first time in many years, she no longer wished to impress her family. She wished she had understood them. And as the golden evening light slowly settled across the old photographs and handwritten letters, everyone sensed that the greatest change of the day had not happened inside the wooden box. It had quietly begun inside a single human heart that was finally ready to measure wealth in an entirely different way. The room remained wrapped in a quiet stillness that no one wished to disturb. The restored photographs, carefully preserved letters, and handwritten family stories continued passing gently from one generation to the next, and with every page that turned, another forgotten memory returned to life. Eleanor slowly looked around at the faces gathered in her living room and realized she was watching something far greater than a birthday celebration. She was watching her family remember who they truly were. Emily stood quietly beside the fireplace, allowing everyone else to enjoy the gift without drawing attention to herself. She answered questions with simple smiles, never mentioning the countless weekends she had spent visiting elderly relatives, searching through dusty attics, restoring damaged photographs, and recording fading memories before time could erase them forever. To her, the wooden box had never been about recognition. It had always been about making certain future generations would never lose the people who came before them. Victoria remained seated, her eyes fixed on one faded photograph showing Eleanor and her late husband standing beside the small farmhouse where their family story had begun. For years she had believed success meant giving people something impressive. Yet, in a single afternoon, Emily had reminded everyone that the greatest gifts were often the ones that quietly protected love instead of displaying wealth. Victoria slowly stood from her chair and walked toward the center of the room. Every conversation faded as relatives instinctively turned toward her. She paused for a long moment before looking directly at Emily. The confidence that had once filled her voice had disappeared, replaced by honesty that felt unfamiliar but deeply sincere. "Emily," she said softly, "I owe you an apology that is long overdue." The room became completely silent once again. Victoria lowered her eyes before continuing. "Today I realized I spent years measuring people by what they owned instead of who they were. I embarrassed you in front of everyone because I believed expensive gifts proved love. I could not have been more wrong." Tears slowly filled her eyes as she struggled to continue speaking. "While I was trying to impress this family for one afternoon, you quietly spent years protecting our family's history for generations you may never even meet. I judged your simple life without ever understanding the richness of your heart." Emily listened without interruption, her expression as gentle as it had been since the beginning of the celebration. Victoria took one final step closer. "I am truly sorry for every careless word I spoke today and for every moment I made you feel small. You deserved gratitude, not embarrassment." No one moved. No one spoke. Emily quietly crossed the room and embraced her aunt without hesitation. Victoria's shoulders trembled as she returned the embrace, overcome by relief and gratitude. Eleanor wiped away tears while several relatives smiled through their own emotions. Pastor Jonathan Reed gently nodded before saying, "Forgiveness is the only gift that becomes more valuable the moment it is given away." The simple words settled gently over every heart in the room. Emily stepped back with the same warm smile she had carried all afternoon. "Families are strongest when we choose each other again," she whispered. Victoria smiled through tears, understanding those words more deeply than anything money had ever taught her. As evening sunlight painted the walls with soft golden light, the wooden box rested quietly at the center of the living room. It no longer looked small beside the expensive presents surrounding it. Instead, every other gift seemed to exist around it, because everyone present now understood that the greatest inheritance a family could ever leave behind was not wealth, but the memories, love, and forgiveness they chose to preserve together. As evening slowly settled across the Tennessee countryside, the birthday celebration no longer revolved around presents or decorations. Instead, family members gathered in small circles throughout the living room, quietly sharing the stories they had rediscovered inside the wooden box. Grandchildren listened with wide eyes as grandparents described childhood adventures that had never before been written down. Cousins compared old photographs, laughing as they recognized familiar smiles passed from one generation to the next. The atmosphere inside Eleanor's home felt lighter than it had in years, as though something invisible had finally been lifted from every heart. Emily Parker moved quietly through the room, collecting empty coffee cups, folding blankets, and helping her mother prepare fresh dessert for anyone who wished to stay a little longer. She smiled each time she heard another family member say, "I never knew that story," or "I had forgotten this photograph even existed." She did not interrupt their conversations because the gift no longer belonged to her. It had become part of everyone. Victoria Hayes remained near the old oak table where the wooden box rested. She gently picked up one of the restored family photographs and traced the edge of the picture with her fingertips before looking toward Emily. This time there was no pride in her expression, only quiet gratitude. She slowly walked across the room carrying the photograph and stopped beside her niece. "Would you show me how you restored these?" she asked softly. Emily looked pleasantly surprised before smiling. "Of course. I would love to." Victoria nodded with sincere humility. "Perhaps we could finish preserving the rest of the family albums together." Emily's eyes brightened. "Grandma would be very happy." Eleanor overheard the conversation and smiled warmly from her favorite chair beside the fireplace. "That would be the greatest birthday present you could both give me," she said. "Not because the albums need restoring, but because families become stronger when they build something together." Several relatives quietly agreed, and before long everyone began searching through closets, shelves, and old storage boxes for more forgotten keepsakes that might still be hidden somewhere inside the house. Children eagerly carried dusty albums into the living room, while older relatives carefully explained the names and stories behind every photograph. Pastor Jonathan Reed watched the joyful activity unfold before speaking softly to Emily. "You did not simply preserve old memories," he said. "You reminded an entire family that their history still has the power to shape their future." Emily looked around the room where laughter had replaced awkward silence and forgiveness had quietly replaced pride. "I only hoped Grandma would know that nothing she built would ever be forgotten," she answered gently. As twilight painted the sky beyond the windows with shades of gold and deep blue, Victoria quietly approached Eleanor and knelt beside her chair. Taking her mother's hands with genuine tenderness, she whispered, "I spent so many years believing I had to impress this family to earn their love. Today, Emily reminded me that love was already here. I simply stopped seeing it." Eleanor gently touched her daughter's cheek and smiled through grateful tears. The heart always finds its way home when it chooses humility. Victoria looked across the room where Emily laughed with younger cousins while carefully placing another restored photograph into a protective album. For the first time in many years, she no longer saw someone she needed to compare herself to. She saw a niece whose quiet kindness had given every generation gathered beneath that roof a priceless inheritance, and in that peaceful evening light, every person understood that the greatest families are remembered not because they possessed extraordinary wealth, but because they chose to protect extraordinary love. 1 year later, another warm spring afternoon settled gently over Eleanor Parker's beautiful home in Franklin, Tennessee. The maple trees surrounding the old house swayed softly in the breeze while children laughed beneath their branches, chasing one another across the green lawn exactly as previous generations once had. The family had gathered again for their annual reunion, but this year something felt entirely different. The conversations were warmer. The smiles arrived more naturally. There were no awkward silences, no quiet comparisons, and no invisible walls separating one heart from another. Emily Parker parked the same aging blue sedan beneath the familiar trees and stepped out wearing her simple light blue dress. She carried no expensive package in her hands because she no longer needed one. As she walked toward the front porch, Victoria Hayes opened the front door before Emily could even knock. Without hesitation, Victoria embraced her niece with genuine affection. "I have been waiting for you," she said warmly. Emily smiled and returned the embrace. "I would not miss this day." Inside the house, the familiar wooden box rested in the center of the living room upon a handcrafted oak table. It was no longer hidden behind expensive presents because there were no elaborate displays this year. Instead, every family member had brought a handwritten memory, an old photograph, or a meaningful keepsake to place inside the box so future generations could continue adding to the family story. Eleanor watched the tradition unfold with quiet gratitude. Her eyes sparkled as grandchildren carefully read old letters aloud while younger children listened with curiosity and wonder. Pastor Jonathan Reed stood nearby, smiling as he watched 3 generations gathered around something that could never be measured by money. Victoria quietly carried another small envelope toward the wooden box before turning to Emily. "This one is from me," she said softly. "It is the story of my parents that I never took the time to write down before. I almost waited another year, but then I remembered what you taught all of us. Memories should never be postponed." Emily accepted the envelope with a grateful smile before placing it gently inside the box. Around the room, cousins compared restored photographs, grandparents shared forgotten stories, and children eagerly asked questions about relatives they had never met. The family history had become more than a collection of documents. It had become a living tradition that brought everyone together each year. Later that afternoon, Eleanor slowly stood beside the fireplace, holding the wooden box in both hands. The room gradually became quiet as every family member turned toward her. She looked lovingly at each familiar face before speaking. "Many people believe inheritance is something left behind after a lifetime," she said gently. "But the greatest inheritance is something we choose to protect while we are still together. Houses grow old. Money changes hands. Possessions eventually disappear. But love carefully remembered becomes a gift that every generation can carry forward." No one spoke after she finished because every heart already understood. Emily glanced toward Victoria, who smiled with peaceful contentment instead of pride. There was no competition left between them, only gratitude for another chance to love one another well. As golden evening sunlight filled the room, the simple wooden box remained quietly at the center of the family, just as Emily had always hoped it would. It had begun as one unexpected gift, yet it had become something far greater than anyone imagined. It reminded every child, every parent, every grandparent, and every generation still to come that the richest families are never remembered for the treasures they accumulate. They are remembered for the love they faithfully preserve, the forgiveness they freely choose, and the kindness they quietly pass from one heart to another until it lasts forever.